It is once again time for Thursday Corner Explore Korea, where we discover more about cultural and travel highlights that the peninsula has to offer. Joining me on the line this week is our arts critic, Andy St. Louis. He is the founder of SEOUL Art Friend, an online platform dedicated to all things Korean contemporary art. Andy, it's good to speak to you again.
Likewise, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. So, what are we discussing this week?
Well, we're going to head to Arario Gallery and check out a solo exhibition by an important yet often overlooked Korean experimental artist named Choi Byungso. And the exhibition is called Sense and Non-SENS and features works that span nearly 5 decades of Choi's career.
Okay, so 5 decades of Choi's works at the Arario Gallery. So it's a retrospective exhibition of sorts then?
Well, not quite on the same scale as a retrospective. There are only about a dozen works on view. I would consider it more sort of a reintroduction of the artist's work to the public, and a timely one at that, given the current climate of the Korean art world and its eager embrace of deserving artists that history has largely disregarded. In fact, Arario Gallery has presented shows with similar objectives in the past, with sculptor Tae-jung in 2009, and media artist Kim Seung-gi in 2018, and she later went on to have a solo exhibition at the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art.
Okay, so let's hear a little of the artist's history then. Can you give us an overview of Choi Byung-so's career?
Absolutely. He burst onto the scene in the 1970s among a group of young avant-garde artists affiliated with the Daegu Contemporary Art Festival, which was at the time a hotbed of experimental art from 1974 till 1979. And thereafter, he quickly became associated with the first generation of monochrome painters, people like Park So-bo and Ha Chong-yan. And Choi eventually participated in group exhibitions, both domestically and overseas, with this monochrome group, and finally was included in the 1979 Sao Paulo Biennial. And now, despite the rapid ascent of his early career, he largely disappeared from the art scene during the 1980s. And he reemerged in the late 90s with the return to prominence in Daegu's contemporary art scene. But his big breakthrough came in recent years in 2016, a solo exhibition at La Musée d'Art Moderne in Saint-Étienne, France, which reintroduced his work into the global conversation of contemporary art.
Well, it sounds like he has weathered some ups and downs throughout his career. You mentioned Choi's affiliation with Daegu's experimental art scene from the 70s, but it spans until the modern day today, his work. Has his work changed over that time as the Korean art world has as well?
I would say, actually, that his work has remained incredibly consistent over the years. So since the 1970s, he's been using ballpoint pen and pencil to black out pages of newspaper, sort of transforming the substance and materiality of very common everyday materials through repetitive gestures. And it's a technique that reflects the artist's experimental spirit and his opposition to conventional approaches to art making. So his dark and ambiguous works really make a strong statement against hierarchies of the art establishment that perpetuate sort of the purity of painting and the pursuit of modernist formalism. So it's actually somewhat ironic that Choi was once considered a monochrome artist, since people like Park So-bo and the rest of the Tansekwa painters have become the very model of institutionalized modernism that he once so vigorously opposed.
Right, Tansekwa is the monochrome movement you talked about earlier. Now, you mentioned his work blacking out pages of newspapers with a ballpoint pen. That is perhaps his most recognizable work. The fact that it's newspapers he's blacking out, though, essentially erasing them, suggests that there is perhaps a social, political dimension to his work as well.
That's right. Choi was born in 1943, which means that he was sort of coming of age at the same time that former President Park Chung-hee was sort of rising to power. And Choi would have experienced firsthand the Park regime's increasing authoritarianism during the 1960s as a student and the subsequent consolidation of authority in 1972 when Park Chung-hee implemented the Yushin Constitution. And on the way, Park sort of kept his firm grip on power with a tight control over the press. It's clear, I think, that Choi's choice of newspaper as his primary medium was a direct response to this clear abuse of power by the sort of authoritarian Park Chung-hee. And for Choi, the simple act of obliterating the untruths and distortions that were printed in the country's daily newspapers was really a gesture of resistance against the totalitarian leanings of the Park Chung-hee regime.
Right, I understand you will see some of these works at the exhibition. Can you tell us more about the exhibition, actually? The title, Sense and Non-Sense, is quite striking. Is it a reference to possibly Choi's distrust of news media?
I think that's one valid interpretation, but it seems to be more directly connected with the philosophy of the French existentialist philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who published a book called Sense and Non-Sense in 1948.
Right.
And Choi's perspective on art is very much influenced by Merleau-Ponty's emphasis on the importance of physical experience and the sort of meaninglessness of the world of reason and logic. And there's actually a sculpture included in Choi's exhibition at Arario Gallery that places this book by Merleau-Ponty between hundreds of blank sheets of paper on either side, so that only the book's spine can be seen. And it's a very enigmatic work from 1998, and it really offers a dichotomy between the book's function of communicating information and the physical impossibility of viewers actually accessing the book's contents. I think it's meant to provoke a new sensibility of perception by challenging assumptions of what an artwork can actually be, which is a common theme that runs throughout Choi's career.
Okay, and what else will viewers encounter in the exhibition as well, Andy?
So in addition to a number of different newsprint works that I discussed before, there's also an impressive installation that occupies much of the gallery's enormous basement exhibition space. And there you'll find 8,000 twisted wire coat hangers that are arranged on the floor to create a continuous rectangular expanse of white monochromatic space, creating an ambiguous mass of arbitrary, individual, deformed coat hangers. So the piece, I think, is a superb embodiment of Choi's insistence on using everyday materials and repetitive techniques to create new perceptual experiences that unfold innovative understandings of materiality and therefore sort of reality itself.
Okay, our listeners should check out our Instagram page where we upload pictures of the exhibitions we talk about in this segment with Andy, including today's. Look up KBS_Korea24 and you'll get a preview of the exhibition as well as updates of our show. The exhibition we talked about today is Byungso's Sense and Non-Sense at the Arario Gallery, on view through February 27th. Andy, any final thoughts on the exhibition before we finish up?
Definitely. I think it's important to not only consider Choi's work within the historical context and the sort of authoritarian repression of the Park Chung-hee regime, but also as a vital component of today's contemporary art discourse. Choi's newsprint works, I think, remain very relevant today, even without this political undercurrent that informed, his development of these works. So I think his persistent practice of using pen and pencil to physically obliterate the words and images printed in the news can offer an important social commentary and examine notions of representation and materialism in an incisive and critical light, which is perhaps more relevant today than ever before.
Indeed. That is where we leave it for Explore Korea. Andy, thank you for telling us about Choi and this exhibition, and we'll talk to you again soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.